Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks.
We've talked a lot about various types of diets, how different types of diets, different types of eating plans can go about in terms of causing changes in health status. That, when combined with exercise and other lifestyle changes, can lead to weight loss, can lead to improvements in body composition. One of the things that we tend to not talk a lot about or discuss a lot about is what impact might the time that we eat, as in what time of the day that we're eating, or when within the day we eat our meals, what impact might that have on all of the changes that we're trying to get in terms of health status, or even more importantly, regulating when we feel hungry, when we feel full, ignoring some of the conversations we've had previously about intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. So the question that we're going to try to discuss here is, does it really matter when I eat? And is there a problem with me doing late night meals, or if I happen to be raiding the pantry late at night? Are those things going to impact my health status, impact my body composition, impact my body weight? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
Whenever the idea about nutrition and metabolism gets raised within the class, when we're talking about physiology and physiological responses as it relates to health and disease and body composition and all of the other aspects that the students want to know in terms of the health issues that come up, once we dispel the idea about the misnomer of caloric balance as it relates to body weight or in terms of weight loss or weight gain, the conversation usually starts to turn to, is it okay to skip meals? Is it okay for me to skip breakfast? Does it matter if I skip breakfast? Does skipping breakfast help with weight loss? Does it help with weight gain? Does it help me with overall performance? And what we have to do is we take a step back and think about, okay, what are we trying to do with the meals? Understanding the fact that meals by itself, food by itself, nutrition by itself is not going to be the end all be all as it relates to either body compositional changes, weight changes, or performance improvements. The thing that we have to remember is that the first meal of the day, regardless of when we have that meal, by definition is a breakfast, because breakfast comes from the two root words, break, fast. Fast being to withhold from eating. And what we're doing is we're breaking that fast. And so whenever I get that question, my immediate response is, it doesn't matter when you eat that first meal. That first meal is going to be breakfast. So you're never really skipping breakfast. That's one of the kind of misconceptions out there. When people say, "Oh, I'm going to skip breakfast and I'm not going to eat until lunch." Well, lunch now becomes your breakfast. The question you really need to ask is, do I need to eat the 3 square meals a day that we keep getting told we need to eat in order to gain or lose weight? Do we need to eat in the morning to lose weight? Should I avoid food late at night if I'm worried about weight loss? This is where we get bombarded with a host of opinions and recommendations, most of which have less than adequate strength to support them, where we get changes in terminology in an attempt to hopefully make oneself sound more intelligent or present a different view than what is being presented by other individuals, simply so that they sound different than what is being presented to them. When we're looking at this idea about when we should be eating and does it matter when I eat, what's the impact that timing has on weight loss as it relates to when do I have my largest meal, or should I be avoiding late night meals? The question we really need to take a step back and look at is, what is the idea about nutrition that we're trying to address with that question? And we have to ignore the misnomers and the misconceptions about calories and caloric balance based off of the need to have some sort of imbalance to lose weight and then somehow reestablish that caloric balance to maintain weight. What we need to remember is that it's about the maximums and the minimums of the nutrients that are necessary in order to maintain optimal performance. Stuff we've talked about a lot in other podcasts and other presentations on the YouTube channel, in other written works on the Substack, as well as in the book Dogmatic Diets, where we addressed what are those root needs in terms of the nutrients. I understand it's kind of simplistic in terms of an address here, in terms of what that idea happens to be, and I understand it's kind of rhetorical the way that we're approaching this. And I also understand that it would be nice to have a very simple answer about following the plan, of following a plan about when to eat, what to eat, how much to eat. What we get instead is multiple opinions, multiple ideas about meal composition, meal size, meal timing, which leads into all of the dogmatic dietary practices that we addressed within the book Dogmatic Diets, as well as what we've talked about on other episodes of the podcast, as well as within the YouTube videos. We get the opinions that tell us that we need to eat large amounts of carbohydrates in these meals. We need to eat more protein in these meals. We need to have our largest meal in the morning. We need to have our largest meal at night. In other words, we have too many opinions being forced upon us, where it's too hard for us to figure out what is actually best for us. It's easy for us to look at what is being presented to us from selective internet returns, from selective social media returns, where we find an opinion that we want to agree with and we agree with it. Finding these agreements does not provide the insight necessary to answer the questions about how to eat, when to eat, what to eat, if we're attempting to either lose weight, change body composition, improve performance, or try to live a healthy life. Especially if we're trying to look at diets that promote specific types of things, such as, oh, you can go ahead and eat less food, but eat lots of protein, eat lots of vegetables, and you will lose fat and gain muscle. That's kind of one of the selling points that a lot of stuff coming across social media feeds tend to promote. But how realistic is that? What is the scientific evidence that we have? We've talked about some of the scientific evidence as it relates to those concepts, but none of those dietary things that get pitched to us talk about when you should be eating. Or is it okay to eat all of your food at night, all of your food in the morning? Is it different in terms of how we go about taking care of this? The scientific evidence that we have provides us an answer that if you're attempting to lose weight, it really doesn't matter when during the day you consume most of your food. That is true if you have established a nutrient balance. And that is true once you've established a nutrient balance without attempting to compensate for any imbalance caused by any additional exertion, such as exercise. Which remembers that we're not talking about caloric balance, we're talking about that avenue of issues that everybody likes to talk about, especially given the fact that the additional energy demands that come about from exercise, from doing physical activity, is only going to add 15-20% to my total energy expenditure within the day, which means that we're not getting a whole large amount of additional energetic demand or additional need to have a caloric imbalance taking place simply from that idea. Long-term looking at this idea of nutrient balance and when we should be eating and how we should be eating. The long-term means to determine a way to adjust your internal responses to nutrient needs is based off of how our brain is going to respond to distinct hormonal signals and those that trigger when I need to eat and when I can stop eating. We regulate eating based off of hormonal responses combined with the way in which our brain is picking up cues within the environment, signals within the environment, that it's time to eat or time not to eat. If we're attempting to reestablish or to establish a nutrient balance that is more in line with what our actual nutrient balance is, what we have to do is we have to change or adjust the way in which the brain responds to those signals. Those signals of I'm hungry or those signals that I'm full. We have to, quote unquote, teach ourselves to know when to eat, when not to eat, so that we're able to ensure that we're decreasing our total nutrient intake. The decrease in total nutrient intake is what's going to stimulate potential weight loss as long as we have other things taking place in terms of hormonal signals. The only way that we're able to teach that new set point, that new I'm hungry or that new I'm full set point, is through changing the timing and the size and the composition of the meals that we eat. By changing the timing, changing the size, and changing the composition of the meals that we eat, and when we talk about composition of the meals that we're eating, we're talking about how much carbohydrate, how much fat, how much protein we're eating within that meal. And it's not what's necessarily on the food labels. When we start looking at this idea about carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, because there's a lot of those substances that are not indicated or identified on the food labels. Example, if we want to say we're going to go to a excessively low carbohydrate diet, but we still like our dairy, we still eat our cheese, we still eat our yogurt, we still drink our milk, we may not have additional sugars added, additional sucrose added. That's usually what is indicated as having the sugar or the additional sugars. They're really talking about glucose, they're talking about sucrose. But we still have lactose, and lactose is a sugar. And so we're not really going zero carb or excessively low carb if we're eating a lot of dairy within our diet, even though we might think that we're doing a low carbohydrate diet. We're just not eating a large amount of sugar. Same thing happens in terms of protein. Same thing happens in terms of fats. When we start thinking about, okay, I'm going to eat a low protein diet or a low fat diet, but I'm having a large amount of nuts. I'm having a large amount of seeds. I'm having a large amount of vegetables, where I'm still going to get, even though I have other nutrients within those things that I'm not getting from, say, like the animal products that I'm giving up, I'm still getting a lot of those other nutrients that I think I'm eliminating. And so ignoring the food labels issues, which we'll come back and talk about in a YouTube video, ignoring that idea, what we're trying to do is we're trying to, by changing how much protein, how much sugar, how much lipid we're having within a meal, how big the meal happens to be, and what is the time in between meals that we're eating, what we're able to do is we're able to establish a new balance point for my meal composition and my meal consumptions. By changing and establishing that new set point for my meal compositions and my meals and my meal consumptions, what I'm able to do is I'm able to reestablish, or to more importantly, establish the balance point necessary to promote long-term weight loss and maintenance. The evidence shows that the timing of your largest meal doesn't matter. There is evidence to indicate that high protein and high carbohydrate meals in the morning is more effective than evening meals of those same compositions for weight loss and maintenance, as the morning meals tend to reduce hunger signals experienced throughout the day. However, the few studies provide support to the opinion that large morning meals leads to greater overall weight loss. The growing body of knowledge that we have indicates that meal timing has only a limited impact on overall weight loss. I'll get to weight gain issues here in a little bit. These studies, these systematic reviews indicate that frequent meals is more important than the timing of the meals if we're able to achieve and then maintain weight loss, as long as we have that newly established balance point. The evidence that we have indicates that for the same total energy consumption, eating multiple small meals throughout the day elicits greater weight loss compared to eating 2 to 3 larger meals throughout the day. If intake is less than expenditure, and better for weight maintenance if intake equals expenditure. Now, we're kind of hampered with the evidence that we have because the studies that were used and the meta-analysis that was done is based off of caloric balance and not based off of nutrient balance. And so from that evidence, we can't indicate about small multiple meals based off of the nutrient composition within those meals relative to the less frequent larger meals throughout the day. The rationale that's given for the difference between the more frequent versus less frequent is based off of the limiting likeliness of overeating. That is, by eating more frequently, you're able to trigger the I'm full signals faster And by triggering that I'm full signal faster, you're able to stop consuming. And by stopping consuming, you're able to limit overeating. And by limiting overeating, you're going to limit the overconsumption of nutrients, which is linked with weight gain. A secondary issue that comes into play when we start looking at timing and meal size relates to when do I get the different nutrients our body needs? As nutrient composition as well within each meal will impact not just when I get full, but how long am I going to go before I start feeling hungry again? And that's because we digest and absorb our foods at different rates. It takes us longer to digest proteins and takes us longer to digest fats than it does to digest sugars, carbohydrates, regardless of the type of carbohydrate we're trying to digest. Which means that if we have a meal composition that is higher in protein and higher in fats, we're going to get full faster and we're going to feel full for a longer period of time than if we have meals that are high in carbohydrates. As the changes in nutrient intakes take place, we will also start to adjust the type of fuels used for metabolism. And by adjusting the types of fuels used for metabolism, we will be able to impact the type of body tissues that get lost and maintained during a weight loss period or throughout the weight maintenance period. The evidence indicates that there is benefit from increased protein intake within each meal relative to other nutrients as it relates to maintenance of fat-free mass or allowing for growth in fat-free mass, lean body mass. We have additional evidence that if meals are consumed late in the day, making higher protein contents, particularly higher protein content with a higher amount of branched chain amino acids, as long as we don't exceed the daily limit for branched chain amino acids, tends to have a better metabolic effect for the individuals relative to those who do not have a higher protein meal or a meal that is higher in branched chain amino acids. The amount of protein in our diet is extremely important when we start looking at what happens to the body during our exercise sessions. And this is where we have to have two kind of caveats here. It's important to increase protein for two reasons. First, eating protein makes sure that we do not compensate, we don't overconsume, we don't overeat for the expenditure made in exercise, because we're going to feel full faster and we're going to stay full for longer periods of time. It's going to take longer for us to get hungry. The addition of protein into our meals allows us to keep and build the fat-free mass, the lean body mass that we're trying to build in exercise, especially if we're combining exercise with dietary restrictions in an attempt to lose weight. The other thing we have to look at as it relates to that increased protein and the exercise sessions is that we need additional protein, not following resistance training as much, but following endurance training exercise sessions based off of the hormonal swings, the hormonal shifts that take place within the exercise sessions that necessitate the need for additional protein simply due to the stresses of exercise, not necessarily the need to build additional tissues that can come about, or that we hope to come about, following resistance training. The other thing we have to look at when we start looking at this idea about this timing of meals and its ability to either assist us with weight loss or help us with maintaining weight loss is the regulatory effect that eating has on our desire to feed, what we refer to as feeding responses. The idea about feeding, the idea about eating, it's a highly complex interaction of a whole host of signals that get integrated within our brain, that get integrated within our cerebral cortex, that leads to the complex behavior of eating. We can divide this into kind of like three areas here. We can divide this into what's happening within the brain, what's happening within our digestive pathways, what's happening metabolically within our body. In this, we look at these regulatory responses, these feedback responses, as being regulated either hormonally or through neurotransmitter signals. And it's these feedback loops that will ultimately control what we cognitively decide to do, what we actually choose to do. That cognitive thought, that choice that we have, can and does override all of the other regulatory issues, all the other hormone responses, all the other feedback loops that come into play that can and do lead to a lot of the eating disorders that may impact the health of individuals. The reflexes and feedback loops combine to encourage both starting and stopping eating by changing signals from two areas within the brain area known as the hypothalamus that will either trigger orexic responses, which come from the orexic center, and orexic is the signal for eating, or trigger signals coming away from that trigger anorexic responses from the anorexic center, the area of the brain that's going to tell me to stop eating. These reflexes are sometimes linked with emotional states, boredom in particular, sight or smell of foods, the cognitive processing of seeing other people eating, that leads us to want to eat, or due to some sort of traumatic event, even if we don't think about it as being a traumatic event, leading to aversion from eating. And all these are based off of change that come about based off of changes in neurotransmitters coming out from that area in the brain, the hypothalamus, that raises two key neurotransmitters, dopamine and serotonin. This dopamine and serotonin are highly linked with our reward center responses and can lead to and do lead to addictive behavior responses as relates to food and to feeding. In addition to this, we also have distinct drives coming from our autonomic nervous system that's going to change how our body is going to expend energy reserves towards either getting food or doing things that have no relationship to food. And so when we start thinking about this idea about the feeding regulations and our behaviors, that change in our nervous system, that change in the autonomic nervous system, the change in our cognitive system is going to trigger changes in other parts of the metabolism taking place in the body. It's going to change hormonal influences. It's going to change hormonal set points. It's going to change hormonal responsiveness that can lead to other types of metabolic signals that come about. When we start talking about these metabolic signals, we start talking about these hormones. The two principal hormones that usually get discussed is leptin and ghrelin, even though there is a whole host of other hormones that come into play. One of the ones that gets a little bit more press nowadays is the GLPs, in particular the GLP-1, as it relates to the Ozempic and the semaglutide medicines that are out there. The mechanisms that we're looking at is, will those changes in hormones initiate or terminate the feeding behaviors? Are they going to initiate me doing everything in my power to eat, or terminate me doing everything in my power to eat? The initiation of feeding appears to work in combination with a positive feedback loop that is going to first increase the desire to eat, then increase the ability to digest and absorb foods that are being consumed, all based off of seeking a reward response, seeking a dopamine fix, as the common phrasing, where termination is going to come about through a negative feedback loop based off of regional responses within the digestive pathway, based off of the digestive pathway, the stomach, the intestines, doing more things because of the food being consumed, in an attempt to slow down the rate of food consumption so that we have a chance to digest and absorb everything that's coming into the digestive pathway, into the stomach, into the intestines. These tend to work in terms of an antagonistic interaction at the hypothalamus, at that orexic and anorexic area, that have pathways that go through the reward centers and into the frontal part of our brain that is going to lead to our psychological drive to eat or to not eat. This drive to eat or not eat acts independent of nutrient requirements for metabolism. That is, even if we think that we're doing a whole bunch of stuff energetically, we're quote unquote burning a lot of energy. that change in fuel need, that change in energy need, is not by itself going to be triggering our psychological drive to eat. Our psychological drive to eat occurs independent of that nutrient requirements that we have. That higher cortical function, that higher brain function, has an impact, or is impacted, I should say, by secondary hormones known as the endocannabinoidal hormones. And this endocannabinoidal hormone is one of the hormones that's going to cause disruption in the normal feeding behavior. The endocannabinoidal system will trigger additional hunger drive and minimize any additional full drives. It's going to make us want to eat more. It's going to trigger a prolonged hunger response. The other thing that comes into play as it relates to this kind of feeding regulation and on the hormonal side and on the metabolic side is the hormonal sensitivity that the hypothalamus has to hormone signals such as leptin and ghrelin, as well as hormone signals like insulin, that will have impacts on the feeling of hunger, the feeling of full, based off of changes that those hormones have. People who express overfatness issues, people who have overfatness, people who have overconsumption of metabolic disruptors, will have limited sensitivity, or can limit the sensitivity to those hormones, to leptin, to ghrelin, to insulin, to GLP-1, along with other hormones that are all linked into this reflex loop, this feedback loop that triggers, am I feeling hunger, or am I feeling full? This insensitivity, this change in responsiveness to the hormones is, or can cause, a lot of overeating issues that we might see come about within individuals who have overfatness issues, or individuals who have overconsumed metabolic disruptors. That's why when we have weight issues associated with specific types of foods, we have to be careful to not label the nutrients found in the foods, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats within the foods, as being the culprit for the weight gains, as it may be metabolic disruptors that we see in those foods, which is why we start looking at bans for specific types of food additives, specific types of food dyes. One of the things, and one of the reasons why we're starting to see more food dyes being banned, more restrictions on some of the food additives that we might see in some of the processed foods, is because they act like metabolic disruptors. And by acting like metabolic disruptors, they impact the inflammation, they impact the health status of the person. And regardless of weight, have the person act as if they are overfat, act as if they have a chronic metabolic disruption taking place, because those food additives, those food dyes, because of the base chemical used to manufacture them, will impact metabolic processes. And by impacting metabolic processes, will trigger overfatness issues for the person. And so if we start looking at this idea in terms of when is the best time to eat, what's the take-home message, what's the take-home recommendation that we can have, is that when we're developing our diet, particularly if we're trying to develop our diet that is looking at weight loss, or trying to develop a negative nutrient intake, or what we refer to as a negative caloric balance, even though that's not the case that we want to try to get. The thing that we have to remember is that it's not necessarily about when we're eating. It's about following the cues for eating. So the first thing we have to kind of remember before we get into this, to what happens about late night meals and the other end of this discussion in terms of weight gain, the first thing we have to remember is that the time that you eat your greatest amount of foods has limited impact on your overall weight loss. That eating more frequently and eating smaller meals is more effective than eating less frequently and larger meals if the intention is weight loss, simply because eating more frequently and eating smaller meals tends to limit overeating. Increasing the amount of protein within the meal tends to lead to fuller signals for longer periods of time. And then increasing protein not only allows you to feel fuller for longer periods of time, but is necessary to maintain lean body mass or fat-free mass during periods of weight loss. And that we have to make sure that we are consuming, as particularly later in the day, protein sources that have higher concentrations of the branched chain amino acids. That we need to be cognizant of all of the drivers that are causing us to eat or are leading us to have food aversions or aversions from eating altogether, based off of that cognitive interplay within the regulatory loops, so that we are eating normally. And you can put quotes around that normally, because normally is going to depend upon the individual. You should be able to reset that regulatory loop based off of patterns of behaviors, so that you're able to not only reestablish a nutrient balance point if you happen to be overweight, or establish a new nutrient balance point based off of grams of macronutrients, grams of micronutrients necessary each day for you to promote healthy weight, to promote weight loss if that is one of the goals you're trying to meet, to allow for body compositional changes. So that's the idea as it relates to timing of meals. And does it really matter if when I'm eating? And once again, it really doesn't matter when I'm eating, as long as I'm meeting my balance points. The other question that kind of comes up with a lot of these conversations is there a problem with eating late at night? And this is where we have to think a little bit. So you have a stressful day. You're bored watching nighttime TV. You get hunger pains because you had such a busy day that you had to skip meals. And now we're raiding the fridge. We're raiding the pantry. We're seeking snacks later in the day. It's the holiday seasons or it's date night, and now you have a late night dinner reservation. You're now eating very close to bedtime. Do we have to be concerned about that in the same fashion in terms of the timing issues of meals? When we start looking at this, the general idea that most people address are two. One is not the idea about weight loss, but the idea about weight gain. The other issue is health impacts that can come about from having later night meals, eating later in the evening. What is it about body weight that we have to worry about, if at all, in terms of this late night meal? There's a lot of noise out there about eating later in the day causing weight gain because of, and I'll put quotes on this, inability to burn off calories in the later meal. And like I was saying earlier, we tend to have this propensity to talk about foods in terms of calories, and using that idea about calories as rationale to avoid late night meals tends to perpetuate the misconception that the only thing that we need food for is to use that food to fuel ourselves to make the energy molecule ATP, adenosine triphosphate, that the cells of our body need to allow us to live. Instead, we have to take a step back again and think about the foods that we eat, not in terms of calories, but what is actually in the food and the mass of food that we're eating. That's how much weight of food we're eating. Because it's the weight of food that we eat that's going to impact our body weight, not the amount of energy in that food that we're eating. The time that it takes for that food to be broken down, the time that it takes for that food to be digested and absorbed, and then the time it takes for it to be transported and deposited throughout the body typically takes hours. It's not something that, okay, I ate at 10 p.m. and when I wake up at 5 a.m., I'm all of a sudden going to be heavier because of the foods that I ate now being added to my tissues. If I weigh any heavier at that 5 a.m. mark because I ate at 10 p.m., it's mainly because that food material is still within my intestines. It's not actually being added to my body. It's not being stored as energy and once again, we've talked about this before. We could talk about it again at a later point in time. It's not being stored as fat within my body, which is what everybody wants to rant and rave about. This means that if we're concerned about the energy in the foods we are eating late at night not being used as energy needs for the day, we're missing the point. It's the nutrients that we look at that must be arriving to the cells of the body that will then be used for energy. But there's not enough time in between the late night meal and when we wake up in the morning to have any additional benefit or any addition to the cells in terms of the nutrients that are in the cells or the over consumption, put quotes around that, of energy of the day that will then be, put quotes around this, stored as fat. So if we think about this, if we're even concerned about this energy requirement issues, the energy in the foods you're eating late at night, and I'm concerned because they're not being used as part of the energy needs of the day, the nutrients may just be arriving at the cells of my body at the point of time when I'm waking up in the morning. It's not going to be any relationship to overconsumption or underconsumption because it's never been part of the balance if we look at it in terms of that idea. Expanding on this, the indication that we get in research about late night meals and this energy balance issue has shown that we have a beneficial impact on tissue growth. We have a beneficial impact on tissue growth following exercise in response to either injuries or illness for people who eat late night meals. And we see within the research improved metabolic flexibility. That is the ability to use carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins for fuel sources to get ATP available to the cells throughout the morning hours. What that means is that if I'm thinking about this late night meal in terms of energy balance issues, it's actually beneficial to me if I've been active that day, or if I want to have better metabolic functions the next morning to have a late night meal. If we look at this and if we think about the meal time or the snack time as it relates to body weight, at least one component of what is being eaten and what we're looking at in terms of body weight is not about the time that the food is being eaten, but the food that is being eaten. That is, how much food are we eating? The amount of food that is being eaten relative to the amount of food needed for fuel, or the amount of food needed to either maintain or grow tissues of the body is the key component here, not the timing. If we're over consuming, if we're eating more food than what the body needs, then we can see gains in weight. And when everybody talks about gains in weight, they're usually talking about fat weight. They're not talking about fat-free weight. If I want to gain muscle mass, if I want to gain bone mass following exercise, I'm going to have a positive nutrient balance. And from the research, it shows having that meal later in the day is going to be of benefit to me. Remembering that is not strictly for that day in terms of this balance point. The amount of food needed within that relative comparison of food for fuel and food for growth is not about a single day occurrence. It's about multiple days and multiple weeks and multiple months. Because one single meal, regardless of when that meal is eaten, will not directly cause changes in body weight. That means that one late night meal, regardless of it being a raid of the fridge or that dinner party that you have to go to, is not going to be the cause for weight gain that we tend to worry about in terms of this idea of eating too late in the day. What we're really looking at, and this is what a lot of people are worried about and tends to be a misconception about the health issues, is what can happen in terms of hormonal responses coming away from that late night meal. And this is where people start getting the misconception of causing insulin spikes, and having a meal that has higher sugar levels causing a negative impact on my insulin, and the negative impact on my insulin causing a negative impact on my body weight. In this argument, many discussions come about in terms of changes in hormone levels, leptin, ghrelin, insulin, but few of these are going to look at how those hormones might have a potential impact on weight gain from individual meals. There is long-term impact that can come into play as it relates to overfatness issues, metabolic disruptive issues on sensitivity to hormones like leptin and ghrelin and insulin and GLP-1, glucagon, growth hormones, insulin-like growth factors, testosterone, estrogen, and a whole host of other hormones. But all of that is long-term issues, not short-term issues, not single meal issues. For those that like to point out that late night meals lead to gains in fat mass, that idea is that they're worrying about changes in these hormones, leptin, ghrelin, insulin, etc. They're worrying about changes in these hormones, and response to these hormones, it's not justified. Especially if we look at the idea of how changes in sensitivity that may take place is based on the concept of changes in circadian rhythms and differences that can occur in between when we see and what spikes we might see in the daytime versus the nighttime. There is some research that has pointed out that we have lower sensitivity to leptin and insulin later in the day. But if that is my rationale for not wanting to do a late night meal because of lowered sensitivity to leptin and insulin, we're missing the point as it relates to fat gain. And the reason for that is because if we're worried about fat gain from late night meals, those hormones is a false front, or worrying about those hormones is a false front, because those hormones are going to be regulating making fats. Insulin and leptin will stimulate lipogenesis, will stimulate the production of lipids. When we have high levels of leptin, high levels of insulin, we tend to have high levels of fat tissue. And that's because those hormones will stimulate the production of lipids. Which means that if I'm worried about having lower sensitivity to those hormones later in the day, I wouldn't be correlating, I wouldn't be associating the late night meal with spikes in those hormones and gains in fat mass. I would, however, worry about fat mass and weight gain if I start thinking about what types of foods I'm eating, not what hormones might get impacted by the foods I'm eating. And it's not about having high carbohydrate stuff. It's more about what types of carbohydrates might be in the foods, as well as what types of food additives we might see in the foods we're eating. So if I'm worried about weight gains, if I'm worried about fat mass gains, the biggest concern would be the type of food that I'm eating and whether or not that type of food can act as a metabolic disruptor that will trigger the overfatness issues that can lead to the weight gain and the fat mass gains in the long term. That is, do those foods contain high amounts of fructose? Because fructose by itself can trigger changes in fat mass without having any changes in the hormones associated with fat production. Are these processed foods? Are these ultra-processed foods? Knowing that processed foods and ultra-processed foods contain food additives that are known to be metabolic disruptors. Are we raiding the pantry and eating all of the processed cookies, all the processed chips? Are we raiding the freezers for the ice creams? Are we going into the pantry and grabbing the candy bars? Are we drinking the sodas that can impact the relative amount of fructose in circulation in my bloodstream, the relative exposure to food additives, both of which are known to be metabolic disruptors? Foods high in fructose, foods high in artificial dyes, foods high in hydrogenated oils can have a negative impact on metabolic functions that can lead to body composition health issues associated with being over fat. And so if we start looking at what a lot of the noise out there is as it pertains to late night meals and weight gain, a lot of them deal with the idea of gaining fat mass because I'm now eating a lot of things later in the day. It's not the fact that I'm eating later in the day is going to cause the weight gain. It's the fact that my nutrient balance is off. So if I'm eating late in the day and I haven't been eating throughout the day, having that later night meal is not going to have a negative impact on me. In fact, it can have a positive impact on me if I'm trying to gain weight, if I'm trying to gain mass, in particular fat-free mass, especially if I'm not going to consume things that have the high ultra-processed foods within it, foods that have the artificial dyes, foods that have the hydrogenated oils, foods that have the food preservatives within it that are known to impact metabolic functions. What about health issues? What health issues? If we start looking at timing of meals and health issues, one of the things that we look at in terms of health issues is that metabolic impact that the timing of meals have as it relates to triggering hormonal responses, triggering inflammation responses. We hear a lot of noise about late night snacking and meals causing metabolic diseases, typically we think about in terms of diabetes. But what we have to remember is that the issues of metabolic diseases, the issues of overfatness, what everybody thinks about in terms of diabetes, is an excessively complex disease. It's a syndrome of multiple things. Diabetes is a symptom of the metabolic syndrome diseases. And it's a highly complex disease that comes about through a host of interconnected behavioral and physiological factors that are not caused by a single factor, that being eating later in the night or not having the correct timing for my meals throughout the day. There are a few health issues that can negatively impact us with late night meals that are dependent upon what you're eating and how much you eat. This is predominantly linked with sleep disturbances, and sleep disturbances can have a host of negative health impacts on them. Based off of what we're consuming, the addition of beverages that contain alcohol or things that contain caffeine can have a negative impact on sleep. Both of them have an impact on disruption of sleep cycle, whether it is when we are actually able to fall asleep, what's usually referred to as onset of sleep, but will also disrupt our normal sleep cycles, leading to less restful sleep. There is some evidence to say that caffeine within a few hours of bedtime can reduce the time and quality of REM sleep. There is also the same evidence to support the impact that alcohol has within a few hours of bedtime in terms of reducing the time and the quality of REM sleep. This can lead to impacts on cognition. This can lead to impacts on critical thinking. This can lead to issues of poor memory response. Alcohol itself, because of the fact that it acts as a depressant, is known to reduce the activity of the nervous system. And for people who are susceptible to sleep apnea or sleep breathing problems, can exacerbate those issues. People who have heartburn issues, acid reflux issues, people who eat late at night can have food collect within the stomach and within the intestines that can lead to issues of heartburn, issues of acid reflux. We can also have issues that get linked with irritable bowel issues, particularly even if we think about these as being healthier snacks, eat things that are higher in fiber, because they're going to stay within the intestines for longer periods of time. That can lead to increased microbiome activity, that can cause increases amounts of gas development within the intestines, that can lead to increased microbe activity, that can cause immune responses within the bowels, that can lead to irritable bowel issues, particularly people who are predisposed to irritable bowel issues. even if we ignore those issues, eating later at night can have issues in terms of sleep disturbance and sleep disruption, especially if we're overeating, regardless of what type of food that we eat. And this is where it goes back to not just the food staying within the intestines and the time it takes for food to be digested and absorbed. If we overeat during the late night meals, we don't have enough time in between eating and when we go to bed to allow the food to move along in a fashion to allow for digestion to take place, which is why if we're going to have large meals, we don't want to have large meals late at night. It goes back to the timing issue of when should I eat and how much should I eat when I'm eating. If I'm overeating, the digestive process can cause sleep disruption, leading to intermittent waking up. That is, waking up throughout the night instead of having a nice continuous sleep. And that's because of change of how food's moving around within the intestines and how that could cause secondary signals within the nervous system that will trigger me to wake up. That poor sleep coming from overeating, regardless of whether that poor sleep comes from the heartburn, comes from irritable bowel issues, comes from bowel issues, come from gas issues, gas buildup. It could be the fact that I may have to have wake up and use the bathroom in the nighttime. All of those issues lead to less restful sleep, poor sleep, and less restful sleep. Poor sleep leads to poor critical thinking, poor cognition, poor emotional control responses, higher amounts of irritability, impaired reaction times, and poor memory as well as poor recall. And so when we start looking at this idea about does it matter when I eat, and is there an issue about eating early in the day versus eating later at night as it relates to my largest meal, there's a few things that we need to kind of wrap our heads around. It goes back to kind of the four things we talked about in terms of does it matter when I eat? And it's all about the foods I'm eating, not when I'm eating. And so even though we hear a lot of recommendations coming out that we should avoid eating late at night, that we shouldn't snack after 7 p.m., especially if we're trying to lose weight or if especially we're worried about gaining weight, those kind of recommendations don't seem to get the support that they should get from the research evidence if they're true. The evidence that we have seems to disagree with these conjectures. The fact that eating late at night, eating snacks after 7 p.m. doesn't seem to have an impact on weight gain or weight loss. Independent of that nutrient balance point, that feeding regulation point that we've established based off of how much we eat, the composition of the meals that we're eating, and when we're eating. It's not really the timing impact. Really doesn't have that big of an impact, even though people want to say that it does. The evidence doesn't support that idea. The type of food that we're eating might have a greater impact than the time that we're eating, especially if the food contains a large amount of metabolic disruptors. Consuming food late at night can adversely impact the ability to have restful sleep, which can impact our health long term. And that's because of the impact that sleep disturbance can have on stress hormones and how stress hormones can elevate inflammation, triggering over fatness issues due to inflammation signals being high, especially when we start looking at this in terms of a chronic issue. Once in a while, not an issue. Every day can become an issue, especially if we start looking at this in terms of a sleep disruption pattern and a stress response to that sleep disruption pattern. It's not about when we eat per se. It's about what we are eating. How does it relate to my nutrient balance? What does it have in terms of metabolic disruption? What does it have in terms of changes of inflammation within my body and how that inflammation can have a negative impact on my body composition? Because once again, we have to remember, it's not necessarily the foods that we're eating or the meals that we're eating or the size of the meals that we're eating or the caloric balance issues that's going to cause the body compositional changes that's going to cause the weight loss. Weight gain and weight loss comes from hormonal responses due to the stresses that we have in our life and the ability that the body has to overcome those stresses to allow us to survive. Well, thanks for listening. Hopefully, we got a bit out of the conversation here in terms of the timing of meals and whether or not having a late night meal will have a negative or positive impact on body weight. If you have questions or comments, please make sure you're leaving it for us. We'd be more than happy to address them in subsequent conversations. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're giving us that big 5-star rating, giving us that big thumbs up, help us out with the algorithms a little bit. Share out with all your friends and family. Please make sure you're following us here on the podcast as well as on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that get posted sporadically to Instagram and onto Threads. Please stay tuned for future discussions on the ideas of health, the misconceptions that we might have about how the human body works, and how we go about having a more healthy lifestyle.